This is the story of a woman who became a dark myth in contemporary culture. Victim, executioner, a product of a chain of abandonment and violence. This is the story of Aileen. She was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her birth surname was Pittman. Her first encounter with the world was marked by the instability of a young and inconsistent family. A teenage mother, a father who never took part in her life, and a childhood that soon learned to distrust adult care. She was abandoned by her mother and raised by her maternal grandparents, who legally adopted her when she was very young. The backdrop of her childhood, alcohol, broken routines, secrets, was firmly established. "Do whatever you have to do to survive, girl," her grandmother told her. "And what if I don't want to do anything wrong?" young Aileen whispered. By the age of 11, there were already exchanges of sex for food and cigarettes. At 14, she became pregnant and gave birth in a home for unwed mothers. Her child was placed for adoption. Her early life included accusations of sexual abuse within the family and episodes of neglect that left her without a solid reference to trust. These early wounds do not justify her actions, but they help explain, in psychological terms, the fragility, anger, and disorientation that would follow. In her youth, Aileen moved from place to place: arrests for theft, driving under the influence, attempts at a normal life that failed, and unstable relationships that provided no refuge. She married briefly in 1976, and the union ended in weeks. Suicide attempts, stints in prison for robbery, and confrontations with the law marked her biography until, in the 1980s, she settled in Florida and began living on the margins, engaging in prostitution and forming emotional bonds with other women in similar precarious situations. In the mid-80s, she met Tyria Moore. The relationship between Aileen and Tyria was complex: companions, lovers, and later, key witnesses in the investigation. Tyria would be both a partner and eventually a crucial witness. Their coexistence unfolded amid economic dependence, emotional violence, and the necessity of survival on the roadside. Aileen began carrying a gun. This was no minor detail. Carrying it symbolized fear, a need for control, and a turning point in how she faced strangers on the road. The nights on Florida highways became territories of caution and tension. What were fleeting encounters for others could, for her, be perceived threats that would trigger memories and decisions. Between the late 1980s and 1990, a series of murders began linking bodies, abandoned vehicles, and witness accounts. The first case that captured investigators' attention was that of Richard Charles Mallory, a man whose death would be central in her trial. Over time, authorities connected several murders into a pattern: men found dead in remote areas, abandoned vehicles, and evidence linking a couple seen nearby. The men whose disappearances or deaths were connected to Aileen included names such as Richard Charles Mallory, Troy Eugene Burris, Charles Richard Humphreys, David Andrew Spears, Charles Edmund Carskadden, Peter Abraham Seams, whose body was never found, and Walter Gino Antonio. Each name represents a family, a file, a point on the map where life was abruptly halted. Prosecutors gathered evidence gradually, allowing them to build charges and compile witness statements. A car accident, a witness recalling two women exiting. A vehicle, victims' belongings appearing in pawn shops. Small details, when combined, began to form a picture. A fingerprint on a receipt and identification of a vehicle were key pieces. The testimony of an eyewitness who saw Aileen and Tyria in one victim's car, and Tyria's later cooperation, would prove decisive in connecting Aileen to the deaths. The investigation was meticulous, tracing movements, tracking sales of items, and conducting nighttime interviews with those who frequented the highways. On January 9, 1991, Aileen was arrested in a bar on the pretext of an outstanding warrant. The arrest was not the end, but the beginning of a cascade of revelations. Her companion Tyria, once located, agreed to cooperate with police in exchange for immunity, and under her guidance, investigators obtained confessions and statements linking Aileen to the murders. A formal confession arrived on January 16, 1991. In that confession, Aileen stated, in varying and sometimes contradictory ways, that she acted in self-defense, that she had been attacked on some occasions, and admitted different motives at other times. The public story became a mosaic of versions. "Why did you do it?" the detective asked. "I don't know. I felt backed into a corner. I couldn't let it happen," Aileen replied, her voice dry. In January 1992, the trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began. The prosecution presented a pattern. The defense sought mitigating factors, including psychiatric evaluations. The press turned the case into a media phenomenon. Aileen's figure transcended the files and became a symbol in debates about gender, violence, marginalization, justice, and the death penalty. The admission of evidence related to other acts, allowed by the prosecution to demonstrate a pattern, complicated the public reading of the case. The verdict arrived, bringing a sentence that would define the rest of her public life. In prison, Aileen became the subject of documentaries, books, and interviews. Her public voice, sometimes cold, sometimes broken, offered varying accounts, at times claiming she acted in self-defense, at others admitting she killed for money or to leave no witnesses. Psychiatric evaluations diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder and antisocial traits. Criminology students and psychological profilers tried to fit her behavior into theoretical frameworks. Documentary makers and journalists could not resist turning her life into a mirror for larger questions. What drives a person to kill? How far does individual responsibility reach when the biography is fractured? They told me I was a monster, but they also said no one saw me before I screamed, Aileen exclaimed, her tone a mix of anger and exhaustion. As sentences were confirmed, 6 death penalties in total, and her name filled the headlines, Aileen's figure became elusive. Cold killer, broken victim, or a combination of both. While courts exhausted appeals, a new element emerged. Public interest in understanding her, humanizing or demonizing her, the films that would follow, and the question that lingered in debates and newsrooms. Yet, in the darkness of her cell, with clocks marking hours like blows, Aileen said something unexpected, a mix of confession and defiance, making it clear that her public image would not be the final word. The story still had a turn ahead. After the 1992 trial, Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to death. In the following years, she received 5 additional death sentences for other murders. She spent more than a decade on death row at the Florida Correctional Center in Marion County. There, routines became ritual. Lights on at the same hour, meals delivered without contact, and footsteps in the corridor could signal a check or the end of the wait. Time in prison measures differently. Each day weighs as much as a year. As the years passed, Aileen began speaking. Journalists, documentarians, and curious visitors came seeking answers, only to find an unpredictable woman. Sometimes rational, sometimes furious, with a speech that oscillated between remorse and defiance. Her words were fragments of a conflicted mind. Yes, I killed those men. But they were men who would have hurt me. I'm not what you want me to be. I'm what the world made me, Aileen exclaimed. Many psychologists agree that Aileen did not fit the classic serial killer mold. She did not seek pleasure, power, or domination. Her acts seemed more like defensive impulses, charged with accumulated rage, fear, and total mistrust of men. Death row became her final stage, paradoxically the only place she was finally heard. The documentary Aileen, The Selling of a Serial Killer, released in 1994, showed something no one had seen before: the commercialization of her story. Agents, paid interviews, television programs seeking to turn her tragedy into spectacle. The journalist returned years later, in 2002, to film her last interview. Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. The woman in front of the camera was no longer the same. Her eyes, once calculating, were lost, her voice broken, her mind tired. She said she heard voices, that the government was watching her, that they wanted to kill her. Psychiatrists examined her and, despite her delusions, found her mentally competent to be executed. Between 1994 and 2002, her lawyers filed multiple appeals in state and federal courts. All were denied. The U.S. judicial system had closed its circle, and the final date was set: October 9, 2002. The night before her execution, Aileen requested coffee and a slice of chocolate cake. She did not want a full dinner. She wrote a short letter addressed, "To anyone who still believes there is something good in me." She did not cry. She did not pray. She only asked to see the sunrise one last time. "I don't want to die, but I also don't want to keep watching the world rot me," Aileen whispered. Aileen Carol Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. Her last words were recorded: "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Words that mixed religion, science fiction, and a strange sense of destiny, a farewell that seemed more like a prophecy. Aileen's story did not end in the execution chamber. That same year, the film Monster began production, starring Charlize Theron, who won an Oscar for portraying her role. The movie showed her not only as a killer, but as a product of a system that had broken her from childhood. Her case became a subject of debate in universities, criminology conferences, and feminist forums. Some see her as a symbol of how perpetual abuse can turn a victim into a perpetrator. Others see her as a criminal beyond redemption. The line between these views remains blurred. Aileen Wuornos was not a monster in the classical sense. She was an open scar on society, the result of abandonment, trauma, poverty, and fear. A woman who walked too long without being truly seen, until it was already too late. And as the sunset paints the asphalt, the narrator's voice slowly fades. Sometimes monsters aren't born, they are made. And sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what they did, but what made them that way. End of story. Aileen Wuornos, The Fury of Abandonment.